Hey, welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to be textual detectives. Yeah, you heard me right. We're diving headfirst into the super fascinating world of ancient Buddhist texts to figure out how scholars piece together a puzzle that's literally 2,500 years old. So this really gets us to the heart of the mystery, doesn't it? I mean, think about it. How do you get a direct quote from someone who lived millennia ago, before any recording devices, before writing was even a common thing? How on earth can we separate what was originally said from centuries and centuries of retelling? That's the huge challenge we're tackling today. And to answer that massive question, we first got to wrap our heads around the puzzle itself. You know, the incredible journey of a teaching from just a spoken word all the way to a written page. Just look at this timeline. It's staggering. For hundreds of years, the Buddha's discourses weren't written down at all, not a single word. They were memorized, they were chanted, and they were passed down purely orally from teacher to student. It was only way, way later that they were finally put to paper, or, palm leaves, in different parts of Asia. And that's what led to these distinct versions that are now our absolute best clues. Okay, so every good investigation needs reliable evidence, right? Well, in our case, that evidence comes from these ancient manuscripts. So let's meet our two key witnesses in this whole detective story. So, on one side, we've got the Pali Canon. This is the foundational scripture for the Theravada tradition, carefully preserved in Sri Lanka. And on the other side, we have the Chinese Agamas. This is a parallel collection translated from Indian texts that traveled all the way to China. You can almost think of them like two long-lost cousins who grew up in totally different countries, but are telling the same family stories, just with slightly different details. And let me tell you, do not underestimate our second witness. As the scholar J.W. de Jong pointed out, these Chinese translations are absolutely essential. They were often created with just incredible rigor and precision, and that gives us an invaluable, completely independent line of transmission to check against the Pali versions. They are a critical piece of this puzzle. So we've got our witnesses. Now we need a method, right? A tool for our investigation. And what scholars use is this really powerful idea that we can call the coherence code. Now, the principle itself is actually pretty simple, but it is brilliant. Back in the day, in the original discourses, being logical and coherent was everything. If a speaker contradicted themselves, their whole argument was basically thrown out. So scholars apply that same logic to the texts themselves. When two parallel versions of a teaching don't quite match up, it's a huge red flag. It signals that something might have been changed or added or maybe even lost along the way. Every single inconsistency is like a breadcrumb on a trail. So this is the detective's method right here, in action. You literally put the texts side by side. You hunt for a difference, and then you analyze it, asking questions like, why is this different? What does this little change tell us about the people who preserved this teaching for centuries? It's a really systematic way of turning what looks like a mistake into a major historical insight. All right, enough with the theory. Let's put on our detective hats and apply this method to some actual examples. It's time to open up the case files. Okay, our first case. This one involves a discourse that uses a series of really powerful similes to teach the importance of patience. Now, both of our key witnesses, the Pali and the Chinese versions, they tell the same core story, but the details start to diverge in a really interesting way. Okay, look closely at this. Both texts list 5 similes for just unshakable patience, and they end with the super famous simile of the saw. But look at numbers 2 and 3. The Pali version lists paint on space and then burn up the Ganges. The Chinese version? It flips them. Now, it seems like a tiny change, right? But this is exactly the kind of clue a textual detective is looking for. It proves that these are related, but definitely distinct lines of transmission. Let's move to our second case. This one looks at the instructions for a really core meditation practice, the contemplation of the body. And here, the differences aren't just about the order of a list. They're about the actual content itself. Okay, so what we're seeing here is a potential shift in focus. The Pali version on the left lists 6 different exercises, but check out one of its key Chinese parallels on the right. It only lists 4. It totally leaves out contemplating the elements and the decaying corpse, and it shuffles the order around, putting breathing at the very end. Now, this could reflect a completely different emphasis in how meditation was actually taught and practiced in that specific community. All right, our final case file. This one is maybe the most subtle, but man, it gets right to the very heart of the spiritual path. Why would someone choose to leave their worldly life behind? Well, the answer, it turns out, might depend on which version of the text you happen to be reading. This is a huge difference. In the Pali version, the motivation is partly practical. It's like, worldly life isn't working out anymore because you can't make more money. But in the Chinese version, that whole economic reason is just gone. The motivation is purely existential. It's a direct response to the suffering of life itself. This suggests a really subtle but incredibly significant evolution in how the spiritual calling was being framed. So, we've gone through the evidence from our case files. What's the final verdict? What have we actually learned from all this detective work? Well, here's the verdict. The goal is not to prove one version is right and the other is wrong. The differences themselves, that's the data. They show us that these teachings were living, breathing traditions that were adapted and shaped by the communities who preserved them. And by comparing these ancient witnesses, we can actually watch that evolution happen. And that gets us so much closer to understanding the common, earliest core of the teachings. You know, when you really think about it, what we've been doing here is a form of archaeology. But instead of digging through layers of dirt to find ancient cities, these scholars are digging through layers of text, comparing all these different manuscripts to uncover the history of ideas and the amazing story of how these profound teachings journeyed through time. And that leaves us with one final thought. We've really just scratched the surface here with a few examples from just one tradition. It kind of makes you wonder, doesn't it? What other incredible stories of human history, of belief, of evolution are just waiting to be discovered, hidden in the tiny variations of our most foundational texts. Thanks for watching.